Well, let's turn together to John chapter 2. This is last week's sermon, but you get it this week because last week our business ran over. So we're a week late, but it's a good scripture. I didn't want to skip it. So John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. And thank you for pre-preaching some of my sermon this morning. So for those of you who shared, that's good confirmation. Well, this is a familiar story, and just like with all these familiar stories, I want to invite us to take the things we think about this story, the things we've learned about the story, the things we know about the story, and just set them aside. We're not throwing them away. We're not Marie Kondoing this. We're just setting it to the side so that we can look at the text with fresh eyes. So let's look at the text together this morning and ask God to give us fresh eyes and fresh perspective on this familiar story. John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best until now." This, the first of his miraculous signs Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. So we talked a couple of weeks ago that these Gospels are full of stories that have a purpose, right? They didn't just sit down and go, "What do I remember about Jesus?" It's not just a biography. They're stories that are meant to tell us something. They have a purpose. And their purpose ultimately is to show us, to demonstrate that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. We read that in Luke's introduction 2 weeks ago. We read that Luke had a specific purpose, that he wanted to show the prophecies that had been fulfilled. He wanted to show that Jesus was the Christ so that people could know and understand and have confidence in these things they had been taught. So John is writing John's gospel, and he says, I've put all of these things together so that you might believe. So even John tells us, John has a purpose in writing this gospel, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, and so that by believing you may have life in his name. So that's John's stated purpose for his gospel. So every time we read a gospel story, we need to know and understand it's there for a reason. It's not just thrown in there. It's there for a reason. So let's look at this story about Jesus changing water into wine. There's some things that we don't immediately pick up on as Western Americans looking at this text from a story 2,000 years ago. Some of that is symbolism. So when we look at this story and we see water being changed into wine, some of us would go, "Hey, it's a better party." Some of us would go, "Oh, no way. Jesus changed it into grape juice, not wine." Right? So we have different responses to that. But at this time and in Old Testament symbolism, wine stood for joy. It stood for joy and abundance. It stood for the blessing of God. It stood for that thing that keeps us standing on solid ground when everything is shaken. So when they come and they say, "There's no more wine," There's no more wine. John is not just giving us commentary on, oh, Jesus went to a wedding and they were all drinking too much and they ran out of wine. He's talking about the larger state of being. We've talked before about the position that God's people were in this first century in Palestine. Ruled over by the Romans, with religious figures who were mostly in it for the power and the position. People who should have been serving their interests, but instead were serving self-interest. And the people were tired. They were tired. They were worn down. They were feeling like there is nothing left for us. There was no more wine. There was no more joy. There was no more deep-seated contentment and satisfaction with life and with their existence. There's no more wine. So Jesus is at this wedding with his mother and with some of his disciples. And it starts the story on the third day. Now that could mean it could be the third day of the week, or it could be that this is the third day of the wedding. Weddings, our weddings, if we're in and out in like 3 hours, we're good. But at this time, weddings were week-long affairs, feasting and celebrating and wishing joy and happiness to the new couple. So it could be that this was the third day of this wedding celebration. And on this third day, about halfway through the wedding celebration, they ran out of wine. They ran out of wine. Now, it's interesting to me that Jesus' mother gets involved in this. She sees that they've run out of wine. She comes to Jesus and she says, "Son, they're out of wine." And he goes, "Mom, not my job." In fact, he calls her woman, which I think is, oh my goodness, right? Those of you who have mothers, I want you to picture what would happen if you said to her, "Woman." Probably not good things, right? Probably not good things. So she says, they're out of wine, and he says, "Woman, why do you involve me? My time has not yet come." It's not time yet. We're just starting this thing. We're just getting it off the ground. He's just started to collect some disciples. He's just started to pour into their lives new teaching, new words of healing and grace. He's just on the cusp of his ministry. My time has not yet come. This isn't time for me to be big and splashy. And like any good mother, she ignores him. She didn't even respond. She doesn't argue with him. She doesn't tell him all the reasons why he needs to do this. She doesn't say, "I've gotten a word from God. You need to do this." She just turns to the servants and she says, "Do whatever he tells you. Do whatever he tells you." So Jesus, he gets the message, right? He gets the message. He doesn't argue with his mother anymore. He honors her and her request. Well, nearby are 6 stone water jars. And John is specific. These are the jars that are used for ceremonial washing, for ceremonial purity. Now, there are certain ceremonies that you could use water in jars for, and there are certain ceremonies that you could not use water in jars. So anything that required serious cleansing had to be from living water, flowing water source. So if you want, you can go dig into all of that ritual history and find out which ones these jars would have been used for. But they were specific for specific ceremonies. So these 6 stone water jars each held from 20 to 30 gallons. Now, it's really easy for us to read through stories like this and to just skip those details. But I want us to picture, I should have brought this with me, but I did not. I want you to picture a 1-gallon jug of milk or water or juice, whatever. 1-gallon jug. Not that. Anyone who's worked in food service has seen 5-gallon buckets, right? When we were at camp, we got pickles in 5-gallon buckets. Not that. Anyone who has a tall trash can in their kitchen has a 15-gallon trash can in their kitchen. Not that. Anybody who's used our big trash cans downstairs in the kitchen, those are 30-gallon trash cans. That, okay? 6 stone water jars holding between 20 and 30 gallons each. If you've worked in industrial spaces and you've seen 50 gallons, just a little bit smaller than that. But not quite that much. But when we read those words, 6 stone water jars used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, we might picture that 1 gallon. But it's not. We might picture that 5 gallons, but it's not. We might picture an amphora that holds 15 gallons. It's not that. We're talking about vats of water. Vats of water. And there were 6 of them. Not 1, but 6 stone water jars. So when Jesus says, fill the jars with water, and they fill them to the brim till they're just ready to overflow, that's between, can you do the math? 6 stone water jars times 20, 120 gallons. 6 stone water jars times 30, 180 gallons. This is just a little miracle, is what I'm saying. It was just a little bit of wine, is what I'm saying. 180 gallons of wine. That's a lot of wine. That's a lot of wine. Picture with me. John is saying, they are out of wine. The people are out of joy. It's run out. It's gone. And Jesus doesn't come and say, bring me a water pitcher. I'm going to give you a little bit of wine. Jesus doesn't say, give me a glass, bring me a glass. I'm going to give you a little bit of wine. Jesus doesn't say, bring me a small vessel. When Jesus comes to restore the joy of his people, he comes to do it not halfway, but entirely. He comes to take what is at that time a religious system that people were, it was in their culture, it was part of their daily lives, but they felt on a very colossal level that it was letting them down. And I'm not saying that as a Christian looking back. I'm saying that in general, if you look at the history with all of the uprisings, all of the ways in which people were looking for a Messiah. In about 150-year period around Jesus' life, there are 6 Messiahs who come up. These are people who are not happy with the way things are. There's no joy. There's no joy. And Jesus comes to bring not just enough to get them through the day, not just enough to get them through this wedding feast. 180 gallons of wine. That's a lot of wine. That's a lot of wine. It's a lot of wine, especially in a culture that usually drank it watered down. So I'm going to say something, and this is completely just from my own speculation. I have to admit that before I say it, okay? Jesus produced this wine at the beginning of his ministry. A ministry that lasted approximately 3 years. Who's to say they weren't still drinking this wine when he was done with his earthly ministry? Who's to say that 180 gallons of wine wasn't still there, bringing joy to that community at the end of those 3 years? It's a lot of wine. John, later in his gospel, he talks about Jesus. He says, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. Not a little bit of life, not a little bit of joy, 180 gallons of wine worth of joy, worth life. And John is clear in saying, this is the first miraculous sign. Kind of came out of the gate with a bang. 180 gallons of wine. Brought to the people in the stone water jars that were part of their religious tradition. And I think that's on purpose. And John puts this story back to back with Jesus clearing the temple. So when I say the stone water jars were used on purpose, I think John put them there. John juxtaposed them with the clearing of the temple on purpose to show that Jesus was coming to bring life into a system that people felt were letting them down, that people felt were betraying them. I can't imagine what it would be like to be born in captivity, to have people rule over me and my people who didn't care about our fortune, didn't care about our health, didn't care about our life. I can't imagine what it would be like to pray to a God who promised me and my people the land I'm living on in captivity. But I can imagine that it would have felt a little bit like God was no longer listening, like God had abandoned me and my people. I can imagine that people looked around and thought, what are we doing this for? And here comes Jesus, turning water, ceremonial water, into wine, to remind people God has not forgotten you, to remind people God cares about your health and your life. God cares about having joy. God cares about restoring you. There's a lot being talked about right now. And by right now, I mean, give me a decade. Surrounding something that's called scarcity mindset. There's a difference between scarcity mindset and abundance mindset. Scarcity mindset says, what I have cannot be replaced. And so I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to take a risk. I don't feel safe and secure in my life. The opposite of that is an abundance mindset, which says, what I have can be replaced. If I give this away, I will not go hungry. If I share, it will be an increased blessing, not a decreased blessing. When we have that scarcity mindset, it's not conducive to walking with joy. The people Jesus was dealing with here had a scarcity mindset towards life, towards their relationship with God, towards the things that they possessed. How many people at this wedding were neighbors who had wine in their storage cellars? Yeah, I am. I'm going to take it to Stone Soup. Of course I am, right? How many of those people at the wedding were neighbors who had wine in their cellars? How many of them saw their neighbor running out of wine and did nothing about it? God doesn't call us just to live in a world where we depend on miraculous provision. God calls us to recognize the provision we already have and to share it. You and I may not be able to get up tomorrow morning and expect there to be 180 gallons of beautiful, delicious red wine surrounding us. But we can take what we have and we can share it with others. And beautiful and delicious, those aren't my words. That's what the master of the wedding feast says, right? He says, "What? This is the best wine I've ever had." God calls us to live and to walk trusting that what we've been given is enough, that we have enough, that we have an abundance to share. God calls us to trust in those areas where we feel like we don't have enough, to ask when we feel like we don't have enough. It's okay. There's no condemnation given in this story. There's no condemnation towards those who planned this wedding feast and ran out of wine. Jesus' mother doesn't say, "Can you believe these people?" Jesus doesn't go, "Come on, woman, it's not even my party." That's not what he says. He says it's not his time, but he doesn't say it's not his party. God calls us to examine our lives, to examine the things that we have, to be abundant in sharing them, and to trust that in those areas that we lack, that God will provide. Whether that's through our friends and neighbors or through the church, whether that's us sharing what we have with our friends and neighbors. God desires for us to live and walk with an abundance mindset. Jesus didn't just give them a glass of wine. Jesus doesn't just give us a glass of life or a cup of joy. When Jesus talks to the woman at the well, which is another story a couple chapters later here, he says, "I will create in you a well of water, living water, welling up to eternal life that will never run dry." That will never run dry. Jesus doesn't long to give us just a little bit of anything. He longs to give us life that will well up in us, that will spill out, that will impact the people around us.